I got a couple questions today about preferential rent, so let's talk about it. A preferential rent is a rent on a rent-stabilized apartment that is lower than the allowable legal cap on that apartment. So, for example, you live in a rent-stabilized apartment, the legal allowable rent is $3,000 a month. But let's say the landlord gives it to you for $2,000 a month because that's just what the market is tolerating at that point in time. The $2,000 is called a preferential rent because it is lower than what the landlord could have legally charged. This should be documented in your rent stabilized lease on something called a preferential rent rider. Now, this is the important thing to keep in mind. When you have a rent stabilized apartment, your rent is only allowed to go up a certain amount every single year, and that amount is voted on by the Rent Guidelines Board. So let's say the vote is 3%. Your rent is allowed to go up 3%, but it needs to be based off of your preferential rent, not the legal rent of your apartment. So, for example, your landlord can't say, oh, I gave you a preferential rent of $2,000 this year, but I'm actually going to charge you $3,000 next year plus 3%. It doesn't work like that. However, prior to 2019, where there were a bunch of rent reforms, that's what landlords could do. They could bump your rent up to that legal cap, even if they had given you a preferential rent the year before. But now your rent increases need to be based on your preferential rent. And since you're here and we're talking about rent stabilization, I want every single person who watches this to go to the link in our bio to request their rental history from the state. DHCR is going to send you a physical record of your rental history, and on that rental history, it's going to tell you what the legal cap is on the apartment, if there was a preferential rent registered, all the things you need to know about your apartment. Drop your questions in the comments and give us a follow for more tips and info on renting in New York City.